The town of Cedarville sat beneath the late afternoon sun, its streets humming with the quiet lull of small-town life. Michael Davis, a 70-year-old black Gulf War veteran, took his usual walk to the pharmacy. His worn leather boots scraped the sidewalk with every step, and the cool autumn air tugged gently at his faded jacket. Michael's heart had seen better days. A heart condition, no doubt a result of years of stressful firefighting work, weighed on him, but nothing could stop him from his daily walks. Routine was his lifeline, one foot in front of the other, day after day. Today, however, something was different. The usual calm of Cedarville was disrupted. A couple of police cars buzzed by, their sirens fading as they disappeared around the corner. People on the sidewalks huddled in small groups, whispering to one another. Michael barely noticed. He focused on getting to the pharmacy, keeping his pace steady to avoid straining his heart. Meanwhile, Officer Jake Harmon gripped the steering wheel of his patrol car tightly. His body thrummed with a familiar but unwelcome surge of adrenaline. Dispatch had reported an armed robbery just a few blocks away, a black male suspect in dark clothing. Harmon's patrol car screeched to a halt as he scanned the street. It wasn't Harmon's first robbery call, but each one heightened the same sense of dread. After 3 years on the force, his instincts had been sharpened by fear more than wisdom. He had grown up in Cedarville, a small-town boy who had always idolized the police. But since putting on the uniform, he found that things weren't as simple as he once thought. His eyes landed on an elderly man walking alone down the street, a black man in a dark jacket. Harmon's pulse quickened. The suspect had been described as dangerous, and though his rational mind told him that this old man didn't look like a threat, his paranoia was already creeping in. Harmon pulled up to the curb, stepping out of the car with his hand on his holster. "Sir," Harmon called out, his voice sharp and strained. "I need you to stop right there." Michael turned slowly, confusion clouding his features. "What's this about, officer?" he asked, his voice calm but weary. "I said stop!" Harmon barked, stepping closer, his eyes darting around, searching for any sign of danger. "Hands where I can see them." Michael raised his hands, one of which still clutched a small white pharmacy bag. "Officer, I'm just trying to get home. I don't want any trouble." Harmon's heart pounded in his chest. The suspect was supposed to be armed. His training and experiences had conditioned him to expect violence in every situation, even when it wasn't there. The old man's calm demeanor only made Harmon's nerves worse, his fear warping the situation. "I need to see some ID," Harmon demanded, his voice growing more aggressive as he moved closer. "It's just my heart medication," Michael said, lifting the bag slightly. "I have my ID in my pocket." Harmon's body tensed. The old man's movements seemed too slow, too deliberate, and the fear inside Harmon screamed at him to act. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Harmon's fingers twitched near his taser. His mind raced, and the adrenaline rush hit him hard. Michael barely had time to respond before Harmon's taser fired. The barbs struck Michael's chest, sending a jolt of electricity through his body. His muscles seized up violently, and his legs buckled beneath him. He collapsed onto the cold pavement with a sickening thud, the white pills from his pharmacy bag scattering across the sidewalk. For a moment the street was silent. Then gasps echoed from the small crowd that had gathered. A woman's voice broke through the quiet. "Has just an old man," she shouted, her phone already recording the scene. Michael lay motionless on the ground, his body trembling from the shock. His face twisted in pain, and his breath came in shallow, irregular gasps. Officer Harmon stood over him, frozen. He had acted without thinking, and now, staring down at the man twitching on the ground, reality crashed over him. This was no suspect. This was no threat. This was an elderly man, and Harmon had made a terrible mistake. A woman from the crowd rushed forward, her phone still in her hand. "Call an ambulance," she screamed. "Hes having a heart attack." Harmon's hand shook as he fumbled for his radio. His voice cracked as he stammered, "This is Officer Harmon. I need medical assistance at Cedarville and Oak. Possible heart attack, suspect down." Michael's breaths grew weaker, his face pale and sweaty. The crowd around them murmured, their phones recording every moment. Harmon stepped back, panic rising in his chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had followed protocol, or at least. That's what he tried to tell himself. But deep down, he knew this was wrong. As the distant sound of sirens approached, the weight of what he'd done bore down on him. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug. This was going to change everything. Across town, Ethan Davis sat at his desk, surrounded by case files. The usual chaos of his job as an assistant district attorney consumed his attention, but despite the demands of his work, something felt off today. He hadn't spoken to his father in months, maybe longer. They had drifted apart after years of unresolved tension, disagreements, arguments, and the unspoken resentment that always lingered between them. The buzzing of his phone on the desk broke his focus. He glanced down at the screen. Rachel. His sister's name flashed across the screen, but Ethan hesitated. Their relationship had suffered too, partly because of their differing views on family matters and their father. His thumb hovered over the decline button, but something in him stopped. With a deep breath, he answered, "Hey, Rachel, what's up?" Rachel's voice was frantic, cracking with emotion. "Ethan, it's Dad. Hesh is in the hospital. A cop tased him." Ethan's mind went blank. What are you talking about?" "They said there was some misunderstanding or something," Rachel continued, her voice trembling. "He had a heart attack, Ethan. He might not make it." For a moment, Ethan couldn't speak. The last time he'd seen his father, they'd fought just another one of the many fights that seemed to define their relationship. Now, a police officer had done this. The shock and disbelief gave way to something deeper, something angrier. "I'm on my way," he said, already grabbing his car keys and rushing out of his office. The drive to Cedarville General Hospital was a blur. Ethan's mind swirled with memories of his father, of how they had once been close, of how things had deteriorated over the years. The fights over his father's stubborn pride, the resentment Ethan held for his father's high expectations, the bitterness that had kept them apart. None of it mattered now. All he could think about was his father lying in a hospital bed, fighting for his life. When Ethan arrived at the hospital, Rachel was already there, pacing in the sterile hallway outside the ICU. She looked up when she saw him, her face tight with fear and anger. "He's in there," she said, nodding toward the door. "They don't know if he'll make it through the night." Ethan's stomach twisted. He had been in courtrooms where life and death decisions were made, but nothing prepared him for this. This was his father, the man who had been larger than life to him growing up, now reduced to a frail figure fighting for survival. A doctor approached, pulling his mask down to speak. "Mr. Davis is stable for now, but his condition is critical. The electrical shock triggered a severe heart attack. We've done everything we can, but it's up to him now." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. He turned to look through the glass window at his father. Michael lay motionless, hooked up to machines that beeped and hissed. He looked so small, so vulnerable, nothing like the strong, unshakable figure Ethan remembered. Rachel spoke quietly beside him. "This wasn't just an accident, Ethan. That Kofi didn't even try to help him. People recorded the whole thing." Ethan's anger bubbled to the surface. "I'm going to make sure they pay for this," he said through gritted teeth. "I don't care what it takes." Rachel nodded, but her voice was soft, uncertain. "Just be careful, Ethan. Don't let it destroy you." Ethan didn't respond. His mind was already racing, planning. This wasn't just about his father anymore. It was about exposing the truth, about holding people accountable. And if there was corruption in the Cedarville Police Department, he would bring it to light no matter how deep it ran. Ethan sat by his father's hospital bed, staring at the monitors that tracked every beat of Michael's fragile heart. The steady beeping felt like a countdown each beat, reminding Ethan that time was running out, not just for his father, but for justice. The anger that had first gripped him in the hospital lobby was still there, burning hotter by the second. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, trying to focus. He knew what he had to do, but the weight of the task loomed large. He had been in countless courtrooms facing impossible odds, but this felt different. This was personal, and that made everything harder. Rachel walked back into the room, her eyes puffy from crying, and sat down beside Ethan. She watched her father for a moment, then turned to her brother. "What are you going to do?" she asked quietly. Ethan rubbed his hands over his face and took a deep breath. "I'm going to start by getting the body cam footage," he said, his voice hard with determination. "I want to see exactly what happened." Rachel looked worried. "Do you really think you're going to get anywhere with this? I mean, you know how it works, right? They'll close ranks, cover for each other." Ethan shook his head. "Not this time. I know how to get through the walls they put up. They can't hide from the truth forever." Later that day, Ethan stood in front of Cedarville Police Department's headquarters, his jaw set in grim determination. The building loomed ahead, looking as unyielding as the system he knew he would have to fight. Inside, he was met by Sergeant Ray Jennings, the head of the department's internal affairs. Jennings was a grizzled man in his mid-50s, with a salt-and-pepper mustache and eyes that seemed to take in everything but reveal nothing. Jennings extended a hand. "Mr. Davis, I'm sorry about what happened to your father. It's a tough situation for everyone." Ethan ignored the handshake, his eyes locking with Jennings. "I want to see the body cam footage from Officer Harmon." Now, Jennings' expression didn't change. "We're conducting our own internal investigation, Mr. Davis. You'll have to wait for the official report." Ethan's patience was already thin. "I'm not here for a report. I'm here for the truth. I know how these investigations go. They drag on, and then nothing changes. I want the footage, or I'll subpoena it." Jennings leaned back, crossing his arms. "I get it. You're upset. But Officer Harmon followed protocol. From what I've seen, it was just a terrible mistake. We're looking into it thoroughly." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "A mistake. My father had a heart attack because your officer panicked. He wasn't a suspect, and Harmon didn't even try to de-escalate. I'm not letting this slide, Jennings." Jennings gave a heavy sigh. "Listen, Mr. Davis. I know you want justice for your father, but sometimes things happen in the heat of the moment. Harmon's been a good cop for years." Ethan's voice grew cold. "Good cops don't tase unarmed old men walking home with their medication." The tension between them was palpable. Ethan knew he wasn't going to get anywhere today, but he had made his presence known. Jennings would see that he wasn't going to be easily intimidated or appeased. As Ethan turned to leave, he muttered under his breath, "He'll be back with a subpoena." The next morning, Ethan arrived at his office early, his mind already working through a plan. His assistant, Marcus, handed him a stack of complaints filed against Officer Jake Harmon over the past few years. Ethan's heart sank as he read through them. Multiple complaints about excessive force, each one dismissed quietly or settled out of court. Harmon had a pattern, and it had been ignored. Worse yet, many of these complaints were tied to Sergeant Jennings, who had overseen internal investigations. "Marcus, I need you to dig into Jennings," Ethan said, flipping through the papers. "I've got a feeling this goes deeper than just Harmon." By noon, Marcus had already uncovered more than Ethan had hoped for. Sergeant Jennings had a reputation within the department. He had protected officers from complaints for years, covering up misconduct and dismissing claims of racial bias. Ethan felt the familiar fire of outrage flare inside him, but he forced himself to stay calm. This was bigger than he thought. If Jennings had been running a culture of silence and protection in the department, it meant that taking Harmon down wouldn't be enough. He needed to expose the whole corrupt system. That afternoon, Ethan met with Karen Lopez, a colleague and fellow assistant district attorney who specialized in civil rights cases. Karen was sharp, tough, and not one to back down from a challenge. "You've got your work cut out for you, Ethan," Karen said after reviewing the complaints. "Jennings has been burying this for years. You think you can get him on this?" Ethan nodded grimly. "I don't have a choice. This goes beyond my father. It's a pattern, and if I don't stop it, more people will get hurt." Karen leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. "All right, it'll help you, but we're going to need more than just these complaints. We need witnesses, other officers who can corroborate what's happening. If we go after Jennings, we need an airtight case." Ethan smiled slightly for the first time in days. "I knew I could count on you." Days passed, and the investigation deepened. Ethan and Karen worked late nights, poring over documents, contacting former officers who had left the Cedarville Police Department in frustration. One officer, Tom Lawson, agreed to meet them in secret. He had left the department 3 years ago after a particularly troubling incident that Jennings had covered up. "I couldn't do it anymore," Lawson said. nervously glancing around the coffee shop where they met. Jennings runs the place like his own little kingdom. You cross him, and you're done. I tried to speak up once, and suddenly I'm getting reprimanded for things I didn't even do. Ethan's pulse quickened. Can you testify? We need someone on the inside who can confirm this. Lawson shook his head. I can't, man. I've got a family. If Jennings finds out I'm talking to you, hell ruin me. Karen leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. You don't work there anymore, Tom. You're safe. But if you don't come forward, this will keep happening. You know that. Lawson hesitated, his hands shaking slightly. Finally, he sighed. I'll do it. But you have to promise to protect me. Ethan nodded, relief washing over him. This was the breakthrough he needed. With Lawson's testimony, he could take down Jennings and expose the corruption that had poisoned the department for years. But the cost was heavy. Ethan was barely sleeping, and the strain was beginning to show. His sister Rachel called him constantly, worried that he was pushing himself too hard. Even his colleagues were starting to notice the toll the case was taking on him. One night, after another long day of work, Ethan found himself alone in his office, staring at a picture of him and his father from years ago. They had been so close once before everything fell apart. Now his father was lying in a hospital bed, and Ethan was consumed by the fight for justice. He wondered if he was doing the right thing. He had dedicated his life to this fight, but at what cost? His relationship with Rachel was strained, his personal life non-existent. And now he was up against a corrupt system that could destroy him if he wasn't careful. Ethan closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He had to stay focused. This wasn't just about him, it was about all the people who had been hurt by officers like Harmon and the system that protected them. He couldn't afford to back down now.
The next day, Ethan received a call from an unexpected source, Detective Sarah, working within the Cedarville Police Department.
She had seen the work Ethan was doing and wanted to help. I've been trying to change things from the inside for years, Monroe said when they met at a quiet diner. But Jennings has too much power. Every time I've tried to speak up, I've been shut down. I've seen what he's done, and I can't keep quiet anymore. Ethan's heart raced. This was exactly what he needed, someone on the inside who could provide hard evidence. Monroe handed him a folder. These are internal reports I managed to pull before they disappeared. Complaints about excessive force, racial bias, all of it. Jennings made sure they never saw the light of day. Ethan flipped through the files, his jaw tightening. This is it, he said. With your testimony and these documents, we can take him down. Monroe nodded, but her expression was grim. It's not going to be easy. Jennings has a lot of friends in high places. If you go after him, you'd better be prepared for a fight. Ethan smiled faintly. I've been preparing for this fight my whole life. That night, as Ethan sat by his father's hospital bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to come crashing down. The investigation was moving fast, but the pressure was building. The media had started picking up on the story, and Cedarville was buzzing with rumors of corruption in the police department. Michael stirred slightly in his bed, his eyes fluttering open. For the first time in days, he was awake, if only barely. "Dad?" Ethan whispered, leaning closer. Michael's voice was weak, but there was a hint of the strength that had once defined him. "Ethan, you're still here." "Of course I'm here," Ethan said, his throat tight. "I'm not going anywhere." Michael's eyes flickered with emotion. "I'm sorry, son. For everything." Ethan shook his head. "No, Dad. I'm the one who should be sorry. I should have been there for you. We both should have been better." Michael's hand moved weakly toward Ethan's. "You're doing good, Ethan. Keep fighting." Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. "I will, Dad. I'm going to make sure they pay for what they did to you." Michael's grip tightened slightly. "Not just for me. For everyone." Ethan nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. He had spent years trying to distance himself from his father, from the pain of their fractured relationship. But in that moment, all of that seemed so small. What mattered now was the fight ahead. As Michael drifted back to sleep, Ethan sat back in his chair, a newfound resolve hardening in his chest. He was ready for the battle to come. The day had arrived. The courtroom was packed reporters, concerned citizens, and a tense silence filled the air as everyone waited for the trial of Officer Jake Harmon to begin. Ethan stood outside the courthouse, his face set in grim determination as the morning sunlight filtered through the crowd. Beside him stood Karen Lopez, her briefcase filled with the evidence they'd gathered over the past few weeks. This was it, the culmination of everything they had worked for. Today, the truth would finally come out. Inside, Judge Catherine Miles, a no-nonsense woman with years of experience handling civil rights cases, presided over the court. She looked down from the bench, her stern gaze sweeping the room as the trial began. Officer Harmon sat at the defense table, his face pale, eyes downcast. He had lost weight since the incident, and the pressure of the trial had visibly worn him down. His lawyer, Tom Kane, stood tall beside him, ready to spin the narrative of a tragic mistake made under pressure. In his opening remarks, Kane painted Harmon as a dedicated officer who had been put in a difficult position. Officer Harmon acted on instinct in a situation where he believed lives could be at risk. His decision to use his taser was a split-second reaction, a regrettable mistake, but not one that warrants the severe punishment the prosecution is seeking. Kane's voice was smooth. Practiced, he was used to these kinds of cases, defending officers who had overstepped. He emphasized Harmon's years of service, his clean record before this incident, and his role in the community as a protector. Ethan listened quietly, his jaw clenched. Kane was trying to twist the narrative, but Ethan was ready. When it was his turn, he rose and addressed the jury, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not about a mistake," Ethan said, his eyes moving across the jurors' faces. "It's about a pattern of abuse and racial bias that has gone unchecked for far too long." Officer Harmon didn't just panic, acted recklessly, driven by the same biases that have plagued this department for years. This was not a split-second decision made under duress. This was a man who saw an elderly black man walking down the street and assumed, based on nothing but his appearance, that he was a threat. Ethan continued, his voice rising with passion. "My father, Michael Davis, was unarmed, cooperative, and posed no threat to Officer Harmon or anyone else. And yet Harmon tased him, causing a heart attack that nearly took his life. This wasn't just an error in judgment. This was an abuse of power, and it's time that abuse is held accountable." The courtroom was silent, the weight of Ethan's words hanging in the air. The jury watched him intently, clearly moved by his opening statement. Over the next few days, the trial proceeded, and Ethan and Karen presented the evidence they had gathered. They showed the body cam footage from Harmon's taser, which captured the moment Michael collapsed to the ground. The footage was difficult to watch. The sound of Michael's labored breathing and the sight of his still body painted a damning picture. Ethan called Tom Lawson, the former Cedarville police officer, to the stand. Lawson's hands shook slightly as he adjusted the microphone, glancing nervously around the courtroom. Ethan gave him a reassuring nod before beginning the questioning. "Mr. Lawson, can you tell the court about your experiences working under Sergeant Jennings and how complaints of misconduct were handled?" Lawson cleared his throat, his voice low. "It wasn't good. Jennings had a way of making things disappear. Officers like Harmon were protected. If there was a complaint excessive force, racial profiling, it would just vanish. They'd either dismiss it or settle quietly, but it never went anywhere." "And you personally witnessed this happening?" Ethan asked. Lawson nodded. "Yes, I tried to report a fellow officer once. He used unnecessary force during a routine stop. Nothing came of it. Jennings shut it down, told me to keep quiet if I wanted to stay on the force." The courtroom murmured as Lawson's testimony sank in. Ethan continued pressing him on the culture within the Cedarville Police Department, slowly unraveling the systemic corruption that had allowed officers like Harmon to act with impunity. Next, Ethan called Detective Sarah Monroe to the stand. Her testimony was the nail in the coffin. Monroe detailed how Jennings had actively manipulated reports, how racial bias complaints had been dismissed or altered, and how officers had been encouraged to control the streets by any means necessary. Sergeant Jennings created an environment where officers were taught that they could act without consequence, Monroe said firmly. "That's why we're here today." The trial took a dramatic turn when Ethan called Officer Harmon to the stand. Harmon was visibly uncomfortable, his eyes darting nervously as he sat down. His lawyer had advised him not to testify, but Harmon insisted, wanted to tell his side of the story. Under cross-examination, Ethan began gently. "Officer Harmon, you've served Cedarville for several years. Can you tell us about your mindset that day?" Harmon shifted in his seat, his voice shaky. I thought I was doing the right thing. We had a robbery suspect in the area, and I saw Mr. Davis walking alone wearing dark clothing. Two thought he might be the suspect." Ethan leaned forward, his tone still calm. "Did Mr. Davis resist you in any way?" Harmon hesitated. "No, he didn't. But he reached into his jacket, and I panicked." Panicked? Ethan's voice grew sharper. "What made you think an elderly man, walking with a bag of heart medication, was a threat?" Harmon's voice cracked. "I don't know. I saw him reach for something, and I thought it was a gun. I've seen things go bad before. I didn't want to take that chance." Ethan's eyes bore into him. "Or was it because Mr. Davis is a black man in a predominantly white neighborhood? Did that factor into your decision to tase him?" Harmon's silence was damning. The courtroom watched in tense silence as Harmon struggled to answer. Finally, he muttered, "Maybe. I don't know. I just reacted." Ethan stepped back, allowing the weight of Harmon's confession to settle in the room. The truth was, Harmon had acted out of fear, and that fear had been shaped by racial bias. The trial was reaching its peak when Ethan introduced the final piece of evidence, a secret recording of Sergeant Ray Jennings instructing officers to use whatever force was necessary to maintain control in Cedarville. The recording, taken by Detective Monroe in a meeting Jennings believed was private, revealed the true nature of his leadership. "We don't have time to babysit these streets," Jennings' voice crackled through the courtroom speakers. "If someone looks suspicious, take control. You know how it is, these types don't listen. You have to make them listen." The jury shifted uncomfortably as Jennings' voice continued, detailing his philosophy of using fear and force to keep order, particularly in neighborhoods with a higher minority population. Ethan's voice was steady as he addressed the jury. "This isn't just about Officer Harmon. This is about a system that taught him to fear and suspect people based on the color of their skin. Sergeant Jennings created a culture where officers like Harmon felt justified in using excessive force, even when it was necessary. This isn't just a tragic accident, the result of years of corruption, abuse, and racial bias." The courtroom was electric with tension. Jennings, sitting at the back of the room, stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable. But the damage had been done. Ethan had exposed the truth, and there was no going back. The jury deliberated for 2 long days. Every minute felt like an eternity for Ethan, Karen, and the entire Davis family. Michael had been stable enough to leave the hospital, but his recovery was slow, and he watched the proceedings from home, waiting for news. Finally, the jury returned, and the courtroom filled with anticipation. The foreperson stood, her voice steady as she read the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Jake Harmon, guilty of excessive force and gross negligence." There was a collective sigh of relief from Ethan's side of the courtroom. But there was more. The foreperson continued, her eyes glancing toward where Jennings sat. "We also find sufficient evidence to support further investigation into the Cedarville Police Department and Sergeant Ray Jennings for corruption and obstruction of justice." Jennings' face tightened, but he remained stone-faced as the media in the courtroom buzzed with excitement. The trial wasn't just about Officer Harmon anymore, had cracked open the entire Cedarville Police Department, and there would be consequences. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements as Ethan emerged with Karen and the Davis family by his side. He glanced at the cameras, the microphones thrust in his direction, but his mind was elsewhere. As the cameras flashed and questions were hurled his way, Ethan's thoughts drifted to his father. He had won. The system had been exposed, and justice had been served. But the victory felt bittersweet. The fight wasn't over, not for Cedarville, not for the countless families who had suffered because of a broken system. Later that evening, Ethan sat with his father at home, the two of them sharing a quiet moment. The tension that had once existed between them was gone, replaced by a mutual understanding that had come from fighting side by side for something bigger than themselves. "I'm proud of you," Michael said, his voice still weak but filled with pride. "You did it, Ethan." Ethan smiled, his eyes glistening with emotion. "We did it, Dad." The trial of Officer Jake Harmon had shaken Cedarville to its core. The once quiet, tight-knit community was now divided. Some believed that Harmon had been unjustly vilified, while others saw his conviction as the first step toward real change. But no one could deny the impact that the case had left on the town. For Ethan, the legal battle was over, but the aftermath was only just beginning. In the weeks following the trial, investigations into Sergeant Ray Jennings and several other officers in the Cedarville Police Department began. Jennings, once the untouchable leader of the department, now found himself at the center of a corruption probe. Reports of misconduct, racial profiling, and cover-ups came pouring out. The walls that had protected him for years were crumbling, and for the first time, there was real accountability. Ethan and Karen Lopez had done what many thought impossible. They had exposed a system that had operated in the shadows for years. But the fight had taken its toll on both of them. Ethan felt the weight of every decision, every move he had made in the courtroom, and how close he had come to losing hope. The town's local media outlets were buzzing with interviews, editorials, and roundtable discussions about the future of Cedarville's police department. The new police chief, appointed temporarily by the mayor, vowed to root out corruption and reform the department from within. There was hope, but there was also skepticism. The people of Cedarville had been burned before, and rebuilding trust would take time. Ethan stood in his father's modest backyard, staring out at the trees that swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. The air smelled fresh after a recent rain, and the sky was a brilliant blue, unmarred by a single cloud. For the first time in what felt like months, Ethan allowed himself a moment of peace. Michael stepped out onto the porch, moving slower than he once had, but with more strength than Ethan had seen in weeks. His recovery was steady, but he still had a long road ahead of him. "Mind if I join you?" Michael asked, his voice rough but warm. Ethan shook his head, offering a small smile. "Of course not, Dad." They stood side by side in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of the past few months hanging between them. Ethan thought back to how far they had come, not just in their fight for justice, but as father and son. "I never thought," Michael began, his voice trailing off as he struggled to find the words. "I never thought we'd end up here, Ethan. I'm sorry. For all the years we wasted fighting. For everything I did wrong." Ethan turned to his father, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes that had once been so rare. "You don't have to apologize, Dad. We both made mistakes. But we're here now, and that's what matters." The following week, Ethan returned to his office, determined to use the momentum from the trial to push for broader reforms in Cedarville. Karen had been promoted to Deputy District Attorney, and together they began laying the groundwork for new policies that would ensure more oversight and accountability in law enforcement. One afternoon, as Ethan was reviewing case files, his phone buzzed on the desk. It was a call from Mayor Carol Evans, a pragmatic leader who had watched the trial unfold with great interest. "Ethan, I wanted to speak with you about something important," the mayor said, after exchanging pleasantries. "What's on your mind?" Ethan asked, curious about the direction the conversation was taking. "We need someone with your experience, your passion, and your integrity to lead the next phase of reforms in this town," the mayor said, her voice earnest. "I know you've done a lot already, but I'd like you to head up the new Community Oversight Board. We're serious about making changes, and I believe you're the right person to help us get there." Ethan was silent for a moment, taken aback by the offer. The Oversight Board had been one of the proposed measures after the trial, a way to ensure that incidents like his father's would never be swept under the rug again. But to lead such an effort meant staying in Cedarville, committing to the town in ways he hadn't expected. "I'll need to think about it," Ethan replied, feeling the weight of the decision. "I understand," the mayor said, "but whatever you decide, I want you to know that this town owes you a debt of gratitude." After the call, Ethan sat back in his chair, staring out the window. The future of Cedarville was uncertain, but for the first time, there was real hope that change could happen. And he was being asked to be part of that change. A few days later, Ethan found himself back at the hospital, not for his father this time, but to speak with another patient, Tom Lawson, the former officer who had testified at the trial. Lawson had been assaulted a few days after the trial ended, an act of retaliation from those within the department still loyal to Jennings. It was a reminder that the fight wasn't over, that there were still people in power who resisted change. Ethan sat by Lawson's bed, feeling a deep sense of responsibility for the man who had risked everything to tell the truth. "I'm sorry this happened to you," Ethan said quietly. "You didn't deserve this." Lawson, his face bruised but his spirit unbroken, shrugged slightly. "It's part of the deal, I guess. But it'd do it again." Someone had to speak up. Ethan nodded, admiration swelling in his chest. "You're a good man, Tom, and what you did testifying it made a difference." "I just hope it sticks," Lawson said, his voice raspy. "This town needs change. Real change." "It will," Ethan promised. "I'm going to make sure of it." As he left the hospital that day, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready for the challenges that lay ahead. Cedarville had been through a reckoning, and while the scars would take time to heal, the seeds of change had been planted. And Ethan knew he had a role to play in making sure they grew. The months passed, and Cedarville slowly began to heal. Reforms were introduced to the police department, with new leadership taking over and a focus on transparency and community engagement. The culture that had once allowed officers like Harmon and Jennings to act with impunity was being dismantled piece by piece. Ethan, now fully committed to leading the oversight board, worked tirelessly to ensure that the changes weren't just symbolic. He pushed for real accountability, advocating for body cameras, independent investigations into police misconduct, and better training programs focused on de-escalation and bias reduction. At home, the Davis family found their own peace. Rachel had moved back to Cedarville to be closer to their father, and their once fractured family began to rebuild the bonds that had been broken over the years. The tension between Ethan and Michael had been replaced by a deep sense of mutual respect and love. They had been through the fire, and they had come out the other side stronger. One evening, as the sun set over Cedarville, Ethan and Michael sat on the porch together, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. The air was warm, and for the first time in a long time, there was a sense of calm between them. "You did good, son," Michael said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "You fought for this town. For our family?" Ethan smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. "We fought together, Dad, and we made it." They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of the past finally lifted from their shoulders. Cedarville still had a long way to go, but there was hope now, a hope that Ethan knew had been born from their shared struggle. And as the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Ethan allowed himself to believe in a future where justice and healing could coexist. The reckoning had come and gone, and now it was time to rebuild. Michael nodded, his gaze softening. "I'm proud of you, you know, for everything you did, for standing up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. It had been a long time since he'd heard his father say those words. "I couldn't have done it without you. You taught me to fight for what's right, even when the odds are against me." They stood in silence again, but it was a silence filled with understanding. The years of tension and unspoken resentment between them had dissolved in the face of everything they had endured together. They had fought for justice, not just for Michael, but for the community. And in doing so, they had found their way back to each other. Henry would go to the meeting spot as instructed, but Jason and his team would follow closely behind, ready to intervene the moment the scammers made their move. Jason couldn't shake the tension in his gut as they made their way to the designated area. Quiet corner of the airport's parking structure, far from the bustling crowds. As they approached, Jason's senses sharpened, scanning the area for any sign of the scammers. The parking structure was dimly lit, the shadows stretching across the concrete like dark fingers. Henry walked ahead, his steps slow and hesitant, his eyes darting nervously around the empty space. Jason's team moved into position, spreading out to cover all possible exits. They couldn't afford to let the scammers slip away. Then, out of the shadows, two figures emerged. A man and a woman, both dressed in plain, nondescript clothing, their faces obscured by baseball caps. They walked toward Henry, their expressions unreadable, but their body language was tense. Jason's heart raced as he watched from a distance, his hand hovering near his radio, ready to give the signal. He could see the moment Henry realized something was wrong, his shoulders tensed, and his eyes widened in confusion. "This isn't Emily," Henry whispered, his voice shaking. Before the scammers could say a word, Jason stepped forward, his voice ringing out with authority. "Stop, Riverport Security! Stay where you are!" The scammers froze, their faces twisting into expressions of panic as they realized they had been caught. Jason's team moved in quickly, surrounding them before they could make a run for it. Henry stood in the middle of the chaos, his hands trembling as he stared at the two people in front of him. The realization hit him like a freight train. Emily wasn't real. She had never been real. Jason approached Henry slowly, his heart aching at the sight of the old man's devastation. "I'm sorry, Henry," he said softly. "I'm so sorry." Henry didn't respond. He just stood there, his face pale, his eyes hollow. The love he had believed in, the hope that had kept him going for 2 long years, had been shattered in an instant. The scammers were led away in handcuffs, their plot foiled, but the damage had already been done. Jason stayed by Henry's side, his heart heavy with guilt and sorrow. He had done everything he could to protect the old man, but it hadn't been enough to stop the heartbreak. Henry looked up at Jason, his voice barely a whisper. "It was all a lie, wasn't it?" Jason nodded, his throat tight. "I'm afraid so, Henry? But you're not alone. I'm here, and we'll get through this together." Henry's eyes filled with tears, his body trembling as the weight of the betrayal finally sank in. Jason reached out, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. For now, all Jason could do was stand beside him as Henry's world crumbled around him. The next few hours felt like a blur. The scammers had been arrested and were being processed by local authorities, but Jason's focus was entirely on Henry. After the confrontation in the parking structure, Henry had grown quiet, retreating into a shell of shock and despair. His shoulders sagged under the weight of the truth, and his eyes were filled with a hollow sadness that made Jason's heart ache. As they sat together on a bench back in the terminal, Jason didn't push Henry to talk. He knew that right now, the old man was grappling with the reality that everything he had believed in for the last 2 years had been a lie. The woman he had fallen in love with didn't exist, and the money he had worked his whole life to save was gone. Henry sat with his hands resting on his lap, his fingers nervously twitching. Every now and then, he would glance down at his phone, as if expecting another message from Emily, but there was nothing. Jason stayed by his side, offering quiet support as the minutes stretched into an uncomfortable silence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Henry spoke. "How could I have been so stupid?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "I gave her everything and it was all a lie." Jason's throat tightened as he heard the raw pain in Henry's voice. He leaned forward, his voice gentle. "You weren't stupid, Henry. These people are professionals. They know exactly how to manipulate good people like you. They make you believe in something real, and they prey on your kindness. It's not your fault." Henry shook his head, his eyes brimming with tears. "But I should have seen it. I should have known better. All those times she asked for money, I just thought I was helping her." Jason could feel Henry's devastation like a physical weight. He wished there was something, anything he could say to make it better. But the truth was, nothing would take away the pain of realizing you had been deceived by someone you thought you loved. "You were trying to help someone you cared about," Jason said softly. "There's nothing wrong with that. You were just doing what any decent person would do." Henry's lips trembled, and he looked down at his hands, wringing them together as if trying to find some comfort in the repetitive motion. I thought she was the one. I thought I had found someone who cared about me." Jason's chest tightened. He understood all too well how powerful that kind of hope could be, especially for someone who had been alone for so long. Henry had clung to the belief that he had found love again, and now that hope had been torn away from him. "I know," Jason said quietly, "and it's okay to feel hurt right now. But you're not alone in this, Henry. You still have people who care about you." Henry glanced up at Jason, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. Like who? I don't have anyone left. My wife's been gone for years. My kids, they don't visit anymore. Emily was all I had. Jason felt a pang of sympathy. The isolation Henry felt was palpable, and it reminded Jason of the conversations he had had with his own mother about loneliness. It was a feeling that could consume someone, driving them to seek out any form of connection, even if it wasn't real. "You've got me," Jason said softly, "and I'm not going anywhere." Henry's face crumpled at those words, and he lowered his head, tears finally spilling down his cheeks. Jason sat beside him, his hand resting on Henry's shoulder, offering silent comfort as the old man wept. It was a long time before Henry finally spoke again. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice hoarse from crying. Jason sighed, glancing toward the exit where the authorities had taken the scammers. "Well, the police are handling the scammers. They'll face charges for what they did. And as for your money, we'll do everything we can to help you recover some of it. But I won't lie to you, it's going to take time." Henry nodded, though his expression remained bleak. "I don't care about the money," he said quietly. I just don't know how to move forward from this." "How do you come back from something like this?" Jason didn't have an easy answer for that. He knew that Henry's road to healing would be long and difficult, and it wouldn't be as simple as forgetting what had happened. The emotional scars of betrayal ran deep, and it would take time for Henry to rebuild his sense of trust and hope. "One step at a time," Jason said gently. "Well, take it slow, and you don't have to go through this alone." Henry looked at him with watery eyes, gratitude flickering in the depths of his sorrow. "Thank you, Jason. I don't know what I would have done without you." Jason felt a wave of warmth spread through his chest. In that moment, he knew that despite the pain Henry was feeling, there was still a chance for him to heal. It would take time, but Jason would be there for him every step of the way. The days that followed were difficult. Henry had retreated into himself, barely speaking and often staring blankly at his phone as if waiting for a message that would never come. Jason checked on him daily, visiting him in the small apartment where Henry lived alone. It was a modest place, filled with memories of a life that had once been full of joy and companionship. Old photographs lined the wall, pictures of Henry with his late wife, Elizabeth, their faces alight with love and laughter. There were images of family vacations, of Christmas mornings spent together, and of Henry's children when they were young. But now, those memories seemed like relics of a distant past, overshadowed by the loneliness that had consumed Henry's life since Elizabeth had passed away. Jason couldn't help but feel a deep sadness as he looked around the apartment. It was clear that Henry had once been surrounded by love, but over the years, that love had faded away. His children, busy with their own lives, had drifted apart from him, and the loss of his wife had left a gaping hole in his heart. Jason found Henry sitting by the window, staring out at the street below. His phone sat on the table beside him, the screen dark. The sense of emptiness in the room was palpable. "Hey, Henry," Jason said softly as he entered the room. "How are you feeling today?" Henry didn't look up at first, his gaze fixed on something far away. After a moment, he sighed deeply and turned to face Jason. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice heavy with fatigue. "I just feel lost." Jason sat down across from him, his heart aching at the sight of the once proud man now so broken. "I get that. And it's okay to feel like that. What you went through, it's a lot to process." Henry nodded slowly, his eyes filling with tears again. "It's not just the scam," he said quietly. "It's everything. My life used to be so full of love, full of people. And now it's just me. I don't even know how I got here." Jason leaned forward, his voice filled with compassion. "You've had a hard life, Henry. Losing your wife, feeling disconnected from your kids, it's a lot for anyone to go through. But that doesn't mean you're alone. You still have people who care about you, and it's never too late to reconnect." Henry shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "My kids don't have time for me anymore. They've got their own lives. I'm just an afterthought." Jason could hear the pain in Henry's voice, the deep sense of abandonment that had driven him to seek out companionship online. He wanted to say something, anything that would ease Henry's pain, but he knew that words wouldn't be enough. What Henry needed was action. He needed to feel like he mattered again. What if you called them, Jason suggested gently. Maybe they don't realize how much you're struggling. Sometimes people just need a reminder that you still need them. Henry looked down at his hands, wringing them together. I don't know, he said quietly. It's been so long, I wouldn't even know what to say. Jason smiled softly. You don't have to say much. Just let them know you're thinking of them. Start small. For a long moment, Henry didn't respond. He seemed lost in thought, as if weighing Jason's words carefully. Finally, he nodded, though there was still a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Maybe you're right, he murmured. Maybe it's time. Jason felt a glimmer of hope as he watched Henry consider the possibility of reconnecting with his family. It wasn't going to be easy. There was a lot of emotional distance to bridge, but it was a start. And that was all Jason could hope for right now. The following week, Jason accompanied Henry to a meeting with local investigators about the scam. It was a formal process, one that required Henry to relive the painful details of his ordeal, recounting how he had met Emily online, how their relationship had developed over 2 years, and how he had sent her his entire life savings, believing he was helping someone he loved. It was hard for Henry to talk about, and Jason could see the toll it was taking on him. But he stayed by Henry's side through it all, offering quiet support as the investigators asked their questions. They took Henry's statement, explaining that while they would do their best to recover some of his lost money, it was unlikely that he would ever see most of it again. When the meeting was over, Henry looked exhausted, his face pale and drawn. As they left the investigator's office, Jason turned to him, his voice filled with sympathy. I know that wasn't easy, he said softly, but you did the right thing by reporting it. You're helping make sure these people can't hurt anyone else. Henry nodded weakly, though his expression remained bleak. It just feels like I've lost everything, he said quietly. The money, the hope, the love I thought I had. It's all gone. Jason placed a reassuring hand on Henry's shoulder. You haven't lost everything, Henry. You've still got a lot to live for. And you've got people who care about you, people who want to see you get back on your feet. Henry looked down at the ground, his eyes filled with sorrow. I just don't know how to start over, he murmured. I've spent so long believing in something that wasn't real. I don't even know who I am without it. Jason's heart ached at the raw vulnerability in Henry's voice. He understood what it was like to feel lost, to question everything you thought you knew. But he also knew that Henry was stronger than he realized. You don't have to figure it all out right now, Jason said gently. Take it one step at a time. You'll find your way again. Henry didn't respond right away, but Jason could see the faint glimmer of hope starting to return to his eyes. It was a small victory, but it was enough. As they walked back to the car, Jason couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility for Henry's future. He had entered this situation as a security officer, just doing his job. But now it felt like something more. Henry had become a part of his life, and Jason wasn't going to abandon him in his time of need. While helping Henry navigate the aftermath of the scam, Jason couldn't ignore the growing sense of guilt that tugged at him. The conversations he had had with his mother, Margaret, kept replaying in his mind her quiet admissions of loneliness, her understanding of Henry's situation. Jason realized that while he had been so focused on helping Henry, he had neglected to fully address the loneliness in his own family. One evening, after another long day at the airport, Jason decided to visit his mother. He knew that they needed to talk, not just about Henry, but about the deeper issues that had been lingering between them for years. When Jason arrived at Margaret's house, she was sitting in her usual spot by the window, knitting a new scarf. She smiled warmly when she saw him, but there was a flicker of surprise in her eyes. Jason didn't usually visit without calling first. Jason, honey, what brings you by tonight? She asked, setting her knitting aside. Jason sat down across from her, taking a deep breath. I wanted to talk to you about something, he said softly. I've been thinking a lot about our conversations recently, about loneliness, and how hard it can be to feel like you're disconnected from the people you care about. Margaret's smile faltered slightly, and she looked down at her hands. It's just part of getting older, Jason. You learn to live with it. But you shouldn't have to, Jason said gently. I've realized that I haven't been around as much as I should be. I've been so focused on my own life, on work, I didn't see how much you needed me." Margaret's eyes filled with emotion, and she shook her head. "Oh, Jason, you don't have to feel guilty. I know you're busy, and I don't want to be a burden." "You're not a burden, Mom," Jason said firmly. "I just didn't realize how much I was missing. And after seeing what Henry's been through, I know how important it is to stay connected to the people we love." Margaret looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'm so proud of you, Jason," she whispered. "You've always had such a kind heart, and I'm grateful for every moment we spend together." Jason smiled softly, reaching out to take her hand. "I'm going to be around more, Mom." "Well, spend more time together, and I'll help with whatever you need. You're not alone in this." Margaret squeezed his hand, her face filled with warmth. "Thank you, honey. That means more to me than you know." Jason stayed with his mother for the rest of the evening, helping her around the house and listening to her stories about the past. It was a quiet, peaceful night, but it felt like a step in the right direction, a step toward healing not just Henry's heart, but his own family's as well. The weeks that followed the confrontation were some of the hardest Henry had ever faced. The realization that Emily had never been real still haunted him, but with Jason's support, he began to pick up the pieces of his life. There were still moments when the grief hit him hard, days when he would sit in his small apartment, staring at his phone, wondering how he could have been so easily deceived. But he no longer felt completely alone. Jason had been a constant presence in Henry's life, visiting him regularly and encouraging him to take small steps toward healing. The sting of betrayal hadn't faded, but Henry found comfort in the fact that someone truly cared about his well-being. Jason's friendship had become a lifeline for him. One afternoon, as they sat together at a small cafe near the park, Henry seemed more at ease than Jason had seen him in weeks. He even cracked a small smile when the waitress brought him his usual cup of tea. "How are you feeling today?" Jason asked, his voice light but filled with genuine concern. Henry stirred his tea absent-mindedly, then set the spoon down with a sigh. "Better, I think. I still have bad days, but it's not as dark as it used to be." Jason smiled. "That's good. It takes time, but you're making progress." Henry nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about what you said, about reconnecting with my kids." Jason's heart lifted at the mention of it. He had been encouraging Henry to reach out to his children, to let them know that he still needed them in his life. It wasn't an easy task. Henry had grown distant from his family over the years, and the thought of mending those relationships seemed daunting. "I think it's a good idea," Jason said gently, "even if it's just a phone call to start. Let them know you're thinking about them." Henry hesitated, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "What if they don't want to hear from me?" Jason leaned forward, his voice filled with reassurance. "You won't know until you try. And even if things aren't perfect right away, it's a step toward rebuilding those connections. They're your family, Henry. They'll care." Henry stared down at his tea for a long moment, lost in thought. Finally, he nodded. "Maybe you're right. Maybe it's time." Jason smiled, feeling a surge of pride for the old man sitting across from him. It had been a long road to this moment, but Henry was finally ready to take the first step toward healing, toward rebuilding his life, not just from the scam, but from the years of loneliness that had preceded it. That evening, Henry sat in his living room staring at his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen, his heart pounding in his chest as he debated whether to make the call. He had spent the entire day thinking about what Jason had said, and though the fear of rejection still gnawed at him, he knew that he couldn't keep living in isolation. If there was any chance of reconnecting with his children, he had to take it. With a deep breath, Henry pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice, and then there was a click as someone picked up on the other end. "Hello!" Henry's heart skipped a beat. It was his daughter, Rachel, her voice filled with the warmth and familiarity he had missed so much. "Rachel," Henry said softly, his voice trembling. "It's me. It's Dad." There was a brief pause, and Henry's heart sank, fearing that she might hang up. But then Rachel spoke again, her tone softer now. "Dad, it's been a long time. Is everything okay?" Henry closed his eyes, feeling a rush of emotions swell inside him. "I'm sorry, Rachel. I know I haven't been around much these past few years, and I've let a lot of things come between us." but I wanted to call to see how you're doing. I miss you." There was another pause, and when Rachel spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "I've missed you too, Dad." For the next few minutes, father and daughter spoke, catching up on the years that had passed since they had last been close. It wasn't an easy conversation. There were unspoken hurts and misunderstandings that still lingered, but it was a start. By the time they hung up, Henry felt a sense of relief and hope that he hadn't felt in years. The next day, Henry called his son, Daniel, and had a similar conversation. While there were still barriers to overcome, Henry's willingness to reach out had opened the door to something new, a chance to rebuild his family relationships and mend the emotional wounds that had festered for so long. When Jason visited Henry a few days later, he could see the change in him. There was a lightness to his demeanor, a sense of hope that hadn't been there before. "I talked to my kids," Henry said, smiling as he sipped his tea. "It's going to take time, but I think we're on the right track." Jason's face lit up with pride. "That's amazing, Henry. I'm really happy for you." Henry nodded, his eyes shining with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Jason. You've been a good friend." Jason smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "I'm just glad I could help." As the weeks passed, Henry's recovery continued. He attended therapy sessions for victims of fraud, where he met others who had gone through similar experiences. It helped him to share his story, to hear from others who understood the pain of being deceived and betrayed. Slowly but surely, Henry was rebuilding his sense of self, learning to trust again, not just in other people, but in his own judgment. But it wasn't just Henry's emotional recovery that was improving. With Jason's encouragement, he had also started to explore the idea of finding companionship again. This time, though, he approached it with caution, determined not to fall into the same trap that had ensnared him before. Jason had helped Henry set up an online dating profile, this time using reputable senior dating websites that were specifically designed for older adults looking for genuine connections. Jason had walked him through the process, teaching him how to recognize the red flags that had led to his previous heartbreak. At first, Henry had been hesitant. The idea of putting himself out there again was daunting, especially after what he had been through. But as time went on, he began to feel more confident, more willing to take a chance on love again. One evening, as Jason visited Henry for their usual cup of tea, Henry brought up the subject of dating. "I've been talking to someone online," Henry said, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Jason raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Really, that's great. Henry, tell me about her." Henry chuckled softly, a hint of shyness in his voice. "Her name is Linda. She's a widow, like me, and we've been chatting for a few weeks now. She seems kind, thoughtful. We haven't met in person yet, but we're planning to have coffee sometime next week." Jason's heart lifted at the news. After everything Henry had been through, hearing that he was open to meeting someone new felt like a victory. "That's amazing, Henry. I'm happy for you. Just take it slow and trust your instincts. If she's a good person, it'll feel right." Henry nodded, his smile growing. "Yeah, I think this time I'm ready." The conversation filled Jason with hope. It wasn't just about Henry finding love again. It was about his willingness to trust and believe in the possibility of happiness. The road to recovery had been long and difficult, but Henry had come through it stronger, more resilient, and with a new sense of purpose. As Jason left Henry's apartment that evening, he couldn't help but feel proud of the man he had come to care for so deeply. Henry had faced unimaginable heartbreak, but he had emerged from the darkness with a renewed sense of hope. And in helping Henry, Jason had also grown. He had learned the importance of compassion, of being present for those who needed him most. A few weeks later, on a sunny afternoon, Jason decided to visit Henry unannounced. He had been thinking about how far Henry had come, and he wanted to check in on him before his shift at the airport. As he made his way to Henry's apartment, he stopped by a florist and picked up a bouquet of fresh roses, a symbol of new beginnings. When Jason arrived at Henry's door, he knocked softly, unsure if Henry would be home. After a moment, the door opened, and Henry greeted him with a warm smile. "Jason." "What a surprise," Henry said, stepping aside to let him in. "I brought you something," Jason said, holding out the bouquet of roses. "Thought these might brighten your day." Henry's eyes softened as he took the flowers, his smile growing. "Thank you, Jason. They're beautiful." As they sat together in the living room, Henry placed the roses in a vase on the table, the vibrant red petals a stark contrast to the wilted bouquet he had once held in the airport. The sight of them filled the room with a sense of renewal, of hope reborn. "How are things going with Linda?" Jason asked, leaning back in his chair. Henry chuckled, his eyes twinkling. "We had our coffee date last week, and it went well. We're taking things slow, but I think this could be something special." Jason smiled, feeling a sense of contentment wash over him. Henry had come so far from the man who had been sitting alone in the airport, waiting for someone who would never arrive. He had found a new sense of purpose, a new connection, and the possibility of love once again. As they sat in comfortable silence, Jason glanced over at the roses, their bright petals a symbol of the journey Henry had taken. It hadn't been easy. There had been heartbreak, betrayal, and moments of deep sorrow, but in the end, Henry had found his way back to hope. And as for Jason, he knew that this experience had changed him too. He had learned the value of compassion, of standing by someone even when the path ahead seemed dark. He had reconnected with his own family, deepening his relationship with his mother, and recognizing the importance of staying close to the people he loved. As Jason prepared to leave, he turned to Henry with a smile. "I'm proud of you, Henry. You've come a long way." Henry looked at him with gratitude, his eyes filled with warmth. "I couldn't have done it without you, Jason. You saved me." Jason shook his head, his voice filled with humility. "No, Henry, you saved yourself. I was just here to help." As Jason stepped out into the warm afternoon sun, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He knew that both he and Henry had found something precious in the midst of their struggle, hope, love, and the strength to keep moving forward. As Jason left Henry's apartment, the sun casting a golden glow over the city, he felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. He had witnessed Henry's transformation from a man trapped in despair to someone ready to embrace life again. If you've enjoyed this heartwarming story about hope and second chances, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you can stay tuned for more stories that inspire, uplift, and remind us all of the power of kindness and resilience. And if you know someone who might need a story like this in their life, make sure to share it with them too. Linda gestured toward the door, and a moment later, Chloe Johnson, now 10 years old, walked in, followed closely by her parents, Mark and Sarah Johnson. Chloe's smile was as bright as ever, and she rushed over to Ethan, throwing her arms around him in a spontaneous hug. "Mr. King," she exclaimed, "Mom and Dad said I could come see the center." Ethan chuckled, returning the hug. "Chloe, you're always welcome here. How's school going?" Chloe beamed. "It's great. I got an A on my art project." "That's amazing," Ethan said, his heart swelling with pride for the young girl who had inspired him to change his ways all those months ago. "I'm sure it's well-deserved." As Chloe wandered off to explore the center with Linda, Mark and Sarah approached Ethan, their faces filled with warmth and gratitude. "Ethan, we just wanted to stop by and say thank you," Mark said, his voice sincere. "We've been following everything you've been doing here, and it's incredible. You've made such a difference, not just in this community, but in so many lives." Sarah nodded in agreement. "You've built something that will last, something that will continue to help people long after we're gone." "That's a real legacy, Ethan." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat as he listened to their words. It wasn't the first time he had been thanked for his work, but coming from Mark and Sarah, the very people he had once wronged, it meant more than he could ever put into words. "You both gave me a second chance when you didn't have to," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "Everything I've done since then, it's because of the grace you showed me. You'll never be able to thank you enough for that." Mark smiled, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "We all deserve a second chance, Ethan, and you've made the most of yours." As they stood together in the heart of the community center, surrounded by the very people whose lives had been touched by the foundation, Ethan realized just how far he had come. He had once measured his worth by his wealth, his status, and his ability to control the world around him. But now he understood that true wealth wasn't about material possessions. It was about the relationships you built, the lives you changed, and the compassion you showed to others. This was the legacy he would leave behind, a legacy of kindness, of growth, of redemption. And as Chloe's laughter echoed through the halls of the center, Ethan felt an overwhelming sense of peace. He had found his purpose, and in doing so, he had found himself. A year had passed since the opening of the new community center, and Ethan's life had taken on a new kind of rhythm, grounded in service, connection, and purpose. The foundation had grown exponentially, with new partnerships and programs reaching even more people in need. But for Ethan, the real success was seeing the lives that had been transformed by the work they were doing. One afternoon, Ethan sat in his office, reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. He had once been consumed by ambition, driven by the desire to climb higher and higher in the world of business. But now his ambitions had shifted. His success was no longer measured by dollars and deals, but by the smiles on the faces of the people he had helped, by the stories of resilience and triumph that filled the halls of the center. As he looked out the window, watching the community bustle with life, Ethan's phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Richard Blackwell, who had recently become one of the foundation's biggest donors and had even started volunteering at the center himself. "Hey, Ethan, just wanted to let you know that we reached our fundraising goal for the scholarship program. I've got some ideas for expanding it even further. Let's talk soon." Ethan smiled, feeling a sense of pride in Richard's transformation. He had once been Ethan's greatest critic, but now he was one of the foundation's most passionate advocates. It was proof that change was possible for anyone, no matter how set in their ways they might be. As the day drew to a close, Ethan left the office and made his way to the community garden behind the Centera project that had been started by some of the families in the neighborhood. The garden was a peaceful, thriving space where people came together to grow fresh produce, share meals, and support one another. Ethan wandered through the rows of plants, his heart full of gratitude for the journey he had taken. He had once been lost in a world of arrogance and entitlement, but now he had found something far more valuable than wealth or power. He had found a sense of belonging, a purpose that went beyond himself. As he stood in the garden, watching the sun set over the city, Ethan thought about the future of the foundation, the future of the community, and the future of the people whose lives they would continue to touch. It was a future filled with hope, a future built on the lessons he had learned about compassion, humility, and grace. And for the first time in his life, Ethan King knew that he had finally found true success. As the foundation entered its second year of expansion, Ethan found himself settling into a role he had never imagined for himself: a mentor, a leader, and a champion for others. The community center had grown beyond anyone's expectations, and the ripple effect of its success was evident in every corner of the neighborhood. New businesses were opening, families were thriving, and the once-neglected area was blossoming. Yet even with all the progress, Ethan knew there was still more work to be done. One afternoon, as he sat in a quiet corner of the community center's cafe, he received a text from Alex Jackson, the young man who had become one of the foundation's most dedicated volunteers. "Hey, Mr. King, can we talk? I've got an idea I want to run by you." Ethan smiled as he read the message. He had watched Alex grow from a skeptical outsider to a passionate advocate for the foundation's mission. And now Alex was a key player in many of the center's initiatives. "Sure, meet me in the cafe when you have time," Ethan texted back, curious about what Alex had in mind. Not long after, Alex entered the cafe, his energy as vibrant as ever. He carried a notebook filled with scribbles and diagrams, and his eyes gleamed with excitement. "Mr. King, I've been thinking," Alex began, sliding into the seat across from Ethan. "We've done a lot of great work here, but I think there's something missing a piece that could make a huge difference." Ethan leaned forward, intrigued. "Tell me more." Alex flipped open his notebook, revealing a series of sketches and notes. "I've been talking to some of the kids who come to the center after school. A lot of them are passionate about technology coding, gaming, robotics, but they don't have the resources to explore those interests. What if we started a tech lab, a place, where they could learn coding, build their own projects, and maybe even get involved in local tech competitions? Ethan's eyes lit up as he considered the idea. He had seen firsthand how important it was to provide opportunities for young people to explore their interests and develop new skills. A tech lab could open doors for kids in the community doors that might otherwise remain closed. "That's an incredible idea, Alex," Ethan said, genuinely impressed. "I think it could be a game changer for a lot of these kids. We'd need to figure out the logistics, but I'm all in." Alex grinned, clearly relieved by Ethan's enthusiasm. "I knew you'd like it. I've already reached out to a few people who might be able to help us get the equipment and software we need." Ethan nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The tech lab could be the next big step in the Foundation's evolution. And it was exactly the kind of initiative that aligned with the Foundation's mission of empowering people through education and opportunity. "Let's set up a meeting next week," Ethan said. "We'll get Mark and Linda involved, and we can start planning how to make this happen." As they wrapped up their conversation, Ethan felt a surge of pride, not just in Alex's growth, but in the Foundation as a whole. It had become a place where people could dream big, where new ideas were embraced, and where anyone, regardless of their background, could find the support they needed to succeed. The tech lab was just the beginning. Later that evening, Ethan returned home to his modest apartment, a far cry from the luxurious penthouse he had once called home. His new space was simple, comfortable, and a reflection of the life he had built since his transformation. He no longer needed the trappings of wealth to feel fulfilled. Instead, his joy came from the work he was doing and the people he was helping. As he sat down at his desk, Ethan picked up an old framed photograph, the one he had taken from his former life. It was a picture of him standing in front of his former company's headquarters, dressed in a designer suit, his arms folded confidently as he stared into the camera. The man in the photo looked powerful, successful, and in control. But now, as Ethan looked at the image, he saw someone else, a man who had been lost, consumed by pride, and completely disconnected from what truly mattered. He had come so far since that time. The arrogance, the entitlement, the need to prove himself, it had all faded away, replaced by a deep sense of gratitude for the second chance he had been given. The journey hadn't been easy, and there had been moments of doubt, but every step had brought him closer to the person he was meant to be. Ethan placed the photo back on his desk, a symbol of his past and a reminder of how far he had come. His transformation hadn't been the result of one single event. It had been a process, one that had required him to confront his own flaws, to make amends for his mistakes, and to embrace the values of compassion and humility. As Ethan stared out the window, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, he thought about the people who had helped him along the way. Mark, Linda, Alex, Jordan, and even Richard. Each of them had played a role in his transformation, and each of them had shown him the power of grace. It was a lesson Ethan would carry with him for the rest of his life. The Tech Lab project gained momentum quickly. Within a few months, the Foundation had secured funding from local tech companies, and volunteers from across the city came forward to help set up the lab. The excitement from the kids was contagious. They couldn't wait to start coding, building robots, and exploring the world of technology. As the grand opening of the Tech Lab approached, Ethan found himself reflecting on his role within the Foundation. He had become a key figure in the organization's growth, but as the Foundation expanded and new leaders emerged, Ethan began to wonder if it was time to pass the torch. One afternoon, as Ethan and Mark walked through the new Tech Lab, watching volunteers install computers and set up equipment, Ethan broached the subject that had been weighing on his mind. "Mark, I've been thinking," Ethan began, his tone thoughtful. "The Foundation is in a great place now, and with the Tech Lab and the new programs, I think it's time for me to take a step back." Mark stopped in his tracks, turning to face Ethan with a puzzled expression. "What do you mean, take a step back? You've been instrumental in everything we've done here." Why would you want to leave now? Ethan shook his head. I'm not leaving, not entirely. I just think it's time for the next generation to take the lead. People like Alex they've got the passion and the vision to take the foundation even further. I want to make sure they have the space to grow into those roles. Mark studied Ethan for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I see what you're saying. You've always been good at seeing the bigger picture. Ethan smiled. I've had good teachers. Mark chuckled, clapping Ethan on the back. Well, if you're serious about stepping back, we'll have to figure out what that looks like. But I get it. You've been leading by example, and now it's time to let others lead too. As they continued their walk through the lab, Ethan felt a sense of peace. He wasn't stepping away from the foundation, he was simply transitioning into a new role, one that would allow others to rise to the occasion. He had built something lasting, and now he was ready to trust the people around him to carry it forward. The grand opening of the tech lab was a resounding success. The local media covered the event, highlighting the Foundation's commitment to providing young people with the skills they needed to thrive in a rapidly changing world. Families from all over the city attended, eager to see what the lab had to offer. As Ethan watched Alex give a speech about the importance of technology in education and the opportunities the lab would provide, he felt an overwhelming sense of pride. Alex had come so far, and now he was stepping into a leadership role that would shape the future of the Foundation. After the event, Alex approached Ethan, a look of determination in his eyes. Mr. King, I just want to thank you for everything. You believed in me when no one else did, and now I feel like I can really make a difference here. Ethan smiled, placing a hand on Alex's shoulder. You already are making a difference, Alex, and I couldn't be prouder of you. A few months after the grand opening of the tech lab, Ethan received an unexpected invitation or request to speak at an upcoming conference on philanthropy and community leadership. The invitation came from one of his former business rivals, someone who had once viewed Ethan's shift toward nonprofit work with skepticism, but had since come to admire the Foundation's success. At first, Ethan was hesitant. Public speaking had never been his strong suit, and the idea of addressing an audience full of wealthy business leaders felt daunting. But as he thought about it, he realized that this was an opportunity to share his story, to show others that change was possible, even for someone as deeply entrenched in the world of wealth and power as he had once been. When the day of the conference arrived, Ethan stood backstage, waiting for his turn to speak. He could hear the hum of conversation from the crowd, a mix of corporate executives, nonprofit leaders, and community advocates. The weight of what he was about to do pressed down on him, but he knew that this was an important step in his journey. As Ethan stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. He looked out over the sea of faces, some familiar, others not, and took a deep breath. Good afternoon, Ethan began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. A few years ago, I stood where many of you stand today. I was at the top of my game, running a successful business, measuring my worth by the size of my bank account and the deals I made. But I was wrong. I was missing something important. Ethan paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. It took a moment of humiliation and a lesson in grace to show me that real success isn't about wealth or power. It's about how we treat others. It's about the impact we have on the lives of the people around us.
As he spoke, Ethan shared the story of his transformation, his encounter with the Johnson family, the Foundation's work, and the personal growth he had experienced along the way.
He talked about the importance of second chances, of forgiveness, and of using one's resources to lift others up instead of pushing them down. When he finished, the room erupted in applause, and Ethan felt a wave of relief and gratitude wash over him. He had shared his truth, and in doing so, he had offered others the opportunity to reflect on their own lives and the choices they were making. As he left the stage, Ethan knew that this was his final act of grace, a chance to inspire others to follow the path he had taken. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about the legacy of compassion and kindness that he had helped build. Thank you for following Ethan's story, a tale of redemption, leadership, and the power of second chances. If this story inspired you, don't forget to hit the subscribe button to stay connected. I'm working on more heartwarming stories just like this one. And your support helps me keep sharing these meaningful journeys with you. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear how this story resonated with you. Together, we can continue to explore stories of transformation, hope, and the impact of kindness. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next one. Over the course of the semester, Ryan shared not just the victories he'd had in his career, but the hard lessons he had learned along the way. He emphasized the importance of empathy, listening, and above all, the responsibility that comes with the badge. Teaching gave Ryan a new outlet for his energy and passion. It wasn't the adrenaline-filled, high-stakes work of policing, but it was just as important. These students were the future, and he was determined to equip them with the tools they needed to lead with integrity. While Ryan was settling into his new role as an educator, Jordan Thompson's star continued to rise. His work on the national level had gained him a reputation as one of the most respected voices in the fight for justice reform. Jordan had helped pass landmark legislation that put ethical limits on the use of surveillance technology, created national standards for police accountability, and expanded community-led safety programs across the country. One afternoon, Jordan called Ryan from his office in Washington, D.C., and with some unexpected news. "Ryan, guess what?" Jordan said, his voice buzzing with excitement. "They want me to run for office." Ryan chuckled. "Who's they? And what office are we talking about here?" Jordan laughed. "A group of people who've been following my work think I should run for Congress. They want me to take this fight from the courtroom to the Capitol." Ryan wasn't entirely surprised. Jordan had always been a fighter, and he had the kind of charisma and conviction that made him a natural leader. "I can't say I didn't see this coming." "Are you thinking about it?" "I am," Jordan admitted. "It's a huge responsibility, but I've been thinking about how much more we could accomplish with the right people in power. If I can push for change at the highest level, why not go for it?" Ryan nodded, though Jordan couldn't see it. "You've always said we need people inside the system to change it from within. This might be your chance to do just that." "I've been thinking the same thing," Jordan replied. "It's a big step, but I think it's the right one." As they talked, Ryan felt a deep sense of pride for his friend. Jordan had spent his life fighting for justice, and now he was on the verge of taking that fight to the national stage. The following year, Jordan launched his campaign for Congress. With his years of legal experience and his proven track record in reform, he quickly gained support from a wide range of voters. His platform focused on criminal justice reform, civil rights, and economic equality issues that had been central to his work for decades. Ryan, though retired, was actively involved in the campaign, offering advice and helping Jordan connect with key community leaders. He traveled with Jordan to campaign events, standing by his side as they continued to push for the changes they had always believed in. On the night of the election, Ryan sat in the campaign's headquarters, surrounded by Jordan's team, watching the results roll in. The energy in the room was electric, but Ryan remained calm, reflecting on everything they had accomplished together. When the final votes were tallied, it was official: Jordan had won the election. The room erupted into cheers, and Jordan was immediately swarmed by supporters and media. But as soon as he had a moment, Jordan made his way through the crowd to Ryan. "We did it, man," Jordan said, grinning from ear to ear. Ryan smiled, shaking his friend's hand before pulling him into a hug. "You did it! I'm proud of you." Jordan nodded, his expression turning serious for a moment. "None of this would have happened without you, Ryan. We've been in this together from the start." As the celebration continued, Ryan couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning of something even bigger. Jordan's election to Congress meant that the work they had started years ago, the fight for justice, fairness, and accountability, was now being carried forward on a national level. And while Ryan was stepping back, he knew that the movement would continue to grow, led by people like Jordan, who were ready to take the next steps. As Ryan watched Jordan deliver his victory speech later that night, he felt a sense of closure and fulfillment. The work they had done together had made a lasting impact, not just in their city, but across the country. They had faced countless obstacles, but through it all, they had never given up. Ryan's life was quieter now, but it was filled with meaning. His time teaching at the university continued to bring him joy, and the students he mentored were already starting to make waves in the fields of law enforcement, social justice, and community activism. His influence would live on through them, and through the work Jordan was doing on a national scale. In the end, Ryan realized that the fight for justice never truly ended. It was passed down from one generation to the next, evolving with each new challenge. But he took comfort in knowing that the work would continue long after he was gone. And as he looked toward the future, Ryan Carter was filled with hope that the lessons they had learned, the battles they had fought, and the progress they had made would lead to a world that was fairer, more just, and filled with opportunity for all. As the story draws to a close, we want to thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of justice, friendship, and change. If you enjoyed this story and want more thought-provoking content like this, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us continue sharing stories that inspire, challenge, and make a difference. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update, and feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear where you're watching from and what impact this story had on you. Subscribe now for more impactful stories and content that makes you think. We value your feedback, so if you enjoyed this story, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for being part of our storytelling community, and stay tuned for more stories that remind us all that no matter how hard things get, we are never truly alone.